Welcome everybody now to our second seminar in our new seminar series, Horizon 2055. And I am going to introduce you, as I mentioned in the first seminar, as it goes along, I'll introduce you to my co-hosts, Gary Koekemoer, now, and then Emma in more detail next week. So Gary is a postdoctoral fellow of the chair, and he is a complex systems theory, let's say, an expert. He recently did a doctorate on the subject. And he uses that not just as a theoretical kind of lens, but also to kind of inform his activism and collaborative efforts, he says, to address environmental and socio-economic issues. So apart from being a postdoc fellow, he's also leading, well, it's part of his postdoctoral work, leading a Nelson Mandela Bay team working on climate resilience, or on a plan for climate resilience for the metro. And that's on behalf of the Presidential Climate Commission. So that is engaging an enormous amount of time and effort from Gary in a very, let's say, uncertain metro setup. But what he's going to be talking about today, just very briefly, is well, we know that our planet is heating up a whole lot faster than we originally thought. And this is a very distressing, terrifying idea that there's going to be enormous changes. Gary says, well, migration, obviously, but where do people go to? And one of the important things is also going to be how we're going to live. Where are our places of abode going to be? And Gary's going to talk us through some of those in this talk. So I'm not going to say much more. I think with that, I will hand it over to you, Gary.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrea. Thanks for the introduction, and hello to everyone. I'm just going to share screen and then take us through. Can I just check that everyone can see the screen?
Yes, it looks perfect to me.
Okay, fantastic. So hello to everyone and good afternoon. So in this series of Horizon 2055, we're trying to sort of envisage the future and also do it a little bit more artistically than before. And so I thought what would be great is just to explore what will home us in that period, you know. So what will our homes look like in 2055? And obviously, because I work in the area of climate and climate change, I understand some of what's coming, or think I know some of what's coming. I'm not sure that anyone can be an expert in this, but wanted to run through some of those ideas. And so the cover picture is a recently built facility up in the mountains in the Alps. And that's one of the possibilities that face us. So as Andrea said, the humans have evolved through two key strategies. The one is that we move when conditions become unlivable or unfavorable. And the other one is that where we settle is that we use the surrounding environment, we integrate with the surrounding environment, and we use the resources available to us to create structures or environments that allow us to survive in those circumstances. And that's generally, you've seen this pattern of movement and settlement throughout the sort of 300,000 years of our history since we supposedly came down from trees in the African forests. And so I wanted to just think about 2055. If we project forward, where would we look at? But before we get there, just to say, these are the two charts that probably are the scariest charts I know. That's the surface air temperature and the sea surface temperature, the average globally. And you'll see there's a little squiggle, red squiggle line on both of those, and that's this year's average. And then you'll see an orange line, which is last year's average. And then you'll see a bunch of gray lines, which are the averages from the years before. And you'll see if you look at the orange line, it's significantly above the norm. And the red line on air temperature is above what it was in last year. And sea temperature, it's somewhat below, but it's heading up to the one. And what we know is that the sea is absorbing a huge amount of carbon, and we think that it's reached its sort of saturation point and is now beginning to heat as a consequence, and is heating something like, I think, 5 times the amount of the air. And so we're seeing a significant amount of heating taking place in our world, and that's changing 2 things. The one thing it's changing is obviously the climate. So it's going to affect currents, it's going to affect winds, it's going to affect rainfall. A hotter temperature allows for more moisture, so our storms and rain is going to become bigger and more serious. And you'll see, I think it's in Queensland, the Gold Coast at the moment, they're experiencing a massive cyclone. They call it a 1 in 100 year event, but it is actually not going to be that. It's going to become quite a regular thing. So we know from the data that we've been collecting and analyzing over the period that 2024 is the hottest year that we've ever had. And the global average went above 1.5 degrees. From pre-industrial times, and the 1.5 is an important benchmark for us because that's the target that was set in 2015 at the Paris Accord, where 195 countries signed up to the keeping global warming below 2 degrees and ideally below 1.5. So the 1.5 has been breached. We've been above it for 14 months at this point in time. And we are looking at around about a 1.7 average at the moment, 1.8 average at the moment, and potentially climbing. So scientists are now debating whether we're through, because what they do is they use a rolling 10-year average. And so that rolling 10-year average isn't at 1.5 yet, but we know for the last 14 months we're through that. And the significant thing about it is that we're a number of years ahead of what we modeled in terms of the business case as usual. And we had a bit of a pause during COVID, and we are still heading, we're also in a La Nina circumstance, which should be cooling us a little bit, and that's not working. So we are very concerned that this month's average will be the coolest you will experience ever again, and it will be that case throughout the world. You see on the map there is a heat, the sort of heat anomalies across the planet, and people have done some work in terms of the bands of livability. So by the big change for us is a 4-degree average temperature threshold change throughout the world. And just to be clear, it's an average. So in some places it will be 1, and in other places it will be 5 degrees, or 6 or 7, whatever be the case. And we know that because the tropics are closer to the sun, it gets more energy, gets more sun. And the estimate is that in a 4-degree world, that band of dark orange there or red, which kind of stretches around the tropics around the world, will become uninhabitable for most of the day. So in the middle of the night, you might be able to do something, but you're not going to be able to live in that condition, and you're not going to be able to grow food in that condition. And the growing food is also a key factor, because you will not. A fair proportion of the world's crops are grown in that belt. And then the yellow belt that you see there, which extends into Europe and North America and into most of South Africa and most of South America, is where it will be inhabitable for most of the day. So, or for large portions of the day. So in our case, in South Africa, for most of South Africa, between probably 10 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you won't be able to go outdoors. It'll be too hot. And again, you will not be able to grow food in that environment unless you can bring it indoors and cool it in some form. And what will happen is that there are two major currents. One is called the AMOC, which is the Atlantic Meridian Oscillation Current, I think it's called, that cools the Atlantic, brings hot water away from the tropics and cool water to the from the Arctic. That they expect will slow down, and that means that Britain becomes very cold overnight. And then the Antarctic, there's a circular current around the Antarctic, which is below us. It's lesser studied, but it is a stronger current. And that also forces a lot of the world's weather patterns. And if that slows, similar things start happening, is that the climate changes fundamentally. There's a bunch of other things that change in relation to that. So the 4-degree change is the one that scientists are really worried about. The current projections are about 2100, but if we look at what is happening and the models, how the models are underestimating, it's entirely possible that by 2055, we will have reached that 4-degree change. And so we will be facing, most of us will probably might have missed 2055, but certainly our children will live in areas potentially that are uninhabitable during most of the day or large portions of the day. And so what happens in that environment is that people will move away from the tropics into the north and into the south. And PE becomes a lot more hospitable for a large amount of people. So we might have mass immigration in 2055 into our city. And so really what we're looking at in around about 2100, we're looking at about 10 billion people. I think it's by 2055, we're looking at about 9 billion people. So 10 billion people in a 4-degree average warmer world is like sitting at the train tracks, train crossing, rolling down your windows, opening your thing and having a party whilst the train is bearing down on you. It really seems that and particularly if we look at how Trump has responded to the climate crisis and how the banks and others and oil and gas industry have responded, it really seems that we're more intent on partying at this moment than we are in terms of dealing with that future. And so I thought, so where do we go from there? And the one line of argument that I've been exploring in a little bit with Andrea is Zizek's work and how he thinks about it. And in his latest work, Too Late to Awaken, he talks about what about the future? How do we deal with the future? So the first thing he says is that we are a dominant species on a relatively small planet, propelling its civilization towards multiple kinds of self-destruction. And he mentions 3 particular ones: climate and ecological breakdown, nuclear self-annihilation, and global social unrest. And we're not seeming to be doing much about it. So that's a conclusion that he draws, and the large proportion of the literature on climate change is generally saying the same thing. And pretty much that's the view from climate scientists at this point, given the American response. And so in using his theory, I wanted to then go a little bit further. And what Zizek, as I understand him, is saying is that actually we need to assume that the worst has happened and then think back what we would have done differently in that process. So we should conceive, so the point that he's making is that conceive of a closed circuit between the past and the future, where the future is causally produced by our acts in the past, and the way that we act now is determined by our anticipation of the future. So our reaction to what we anticipate. So it's this closed loop of our future is a creation of our past, of the actions that we took place in the past, but our current is looking at the future. We're anticipating the future, so we act in anticipation of the future. And he says that okay, maybe what we need to do is perceive catastrophe as our fate, as unavoidable, and then project ourselves into that future, adopting its standpoint, where we then retroactively look into the past and those counterfactual possibilities, and then act on those possibilities today. So what he's saying is anticipate the broken future or the catastrophe that he talks about, and think, imagine yourself in that circumstance, and what you would have done differently is how I read him, to get you to that point, and that you then start acting on those different things that we can do. So it's a different way of seeing things. And in the work that I do in climate resilience, we're trying to create a strategic framework, and strategic frameworks are about strategy. And how do you strategize in a complex world is one of the fundamental questions that we're faced with. So if you think about evolution never doesn't strategize. Evolution simply responds to the circumstance at the time, and it doesn't adapt in response to the circumstance. What it does is the natural selection selects those beings or things that are most adapted or best adapted at that point, and that's what survives. So it's not a forward-looking strategic planning process that evolution follows. It's kind of a reactionary or reactive response. And so in my own head, I'm still struggling with this idea of how do you plan when evolution has never planned? But I thought a fun way of then looking at this is to then think through, okay, where would we live in a 4-degree world? And the first obvious one is that we could live in a sort of Atlantis, where we live below the sea, that the sea acts as a protective barrier for us, and where we then can rehome ourselves. And in analyzing these, I've gone through a sort of first order needs and second order sort of challenges in terms of what that environment would look like and do for us. So the obvious thing is underwater is you would need oxygen. We don't have gills, so we're not able to convert the oxygen that exists there into breathable oxygen. So we would drown unless we make some form of it. And the best form we have at the moment is kind of scuba environments or bottled oxygen that we take down. And that's a big challenge for us. The other challenge is light. Is that light disappears at about 40, 50, 60 meters. And we need light for photosynthesis, and we also need light for ourselves in terms of vitamin D. So without light, we would not be able to live. And then the other problem too for us underwater is pressure, is that at sort of 40 meters is the deepest we can dive. Humans can dive in normal scuba gear. We can go to several depths below that. I think the deepest the ocean goes to is 1,200. No, it's more than that. Substantially, I think 4,000 meters or something. But we are unable to build structures that can survive that pressure at this point in time on a large scale basis. We can build remote units, but we can't do that there. The other issue that we would face is obviously temperature, is that there's a huge change in temperature below levels that we can contain. We can't drink salt water, so we would need to do something to find water, and desalination is a process, but it's very energy intensive at the moment, creates a lot of brine. And then the key problem is what do we do with our waste? How would we recycle our waste, or would we just pump it into the sea and then drink it back again? Another key problem is obviously food. Would we live off seaweed, or would we grow crops under certain conditions? But all of this will require energy, and how would we get energy to our places, our abodes? And then given the salt, most of our construction is built out of metal or concrete or glass, and both concrete and metal don't do well in high salt environments. So corrosion, how would we maintain these structures underwater? And then carbon dioxide release. So we release carbon dioxide when we breathe. Would we use plants to recycle that? What would we do with that? And then the final thing is underwater is that we would deal with current and swell dynamics. So the currents are going to change on us. How do you build when you don't know what the currents are going to do? So those are the sort of first order primary things that we have to get in place to survive. The second order things is that how do we communicate then? Is it sea cables? We won't have cell phone towers because they can't penetrate into the water at this point in time. So how do you communicate with the community next to you? How do you transport each other? We don't have mass underwater vehicles other than submarines, which are very transport unfriendly. You can't just simply step onto a submarine and catch it to the next stop. Community, how do you form community underwater? We are social beings. We need community. Or do we live in homes and through screens? And then trade. How do we trade stuff? How do we exchange stuff? Will money be available to us? And then exercise. You will live in small containerized units. Are you going to be on an exercise bike that powers the building or something like that? How do you deal with exercise? And then what do you do in terms of security, external threats? How do you protect against other persons wanting to come and take what you have? So if you look at all of the environments, those kind of questions repeat themselves. So the underwater is one of the ways, and then silos built into the ground is another. And I don't know if you've seen on the streaming services at the moment that there's a number of sort of programs dedicated to the idea of silo living. So there is one called, I think it's called The Silo. There's a couple of other very interesting ones. And this idea that you have compartmentalized levels. Some grow, some eat, some are sleeping accommodation. And this one that I have on the screen at the moment is an actual existing one that's built into an old nuclear missile site somewhere in a secret location in America that's guarded. You can see it. This is an existing one, and it's built for rich people. And so the kind of things that you have to overcome are very similar to underwater. Seismic movement is the one thing that's different here, is that mountains move, the ground moves. So how do you prevent that? But also and oxygen, in terms of circulating oxygen throughout the building, and how would you deal with that? But the other challenges remain the same in terms of communication, transport, community, trade, exercise, and security. But the key thing for this one is this idea that this is accommodation for rich people. So you buy your way into this community. And if we all move to silos, how will we create that process of accommodating people into that? Or will we simply leave people that cannot afford it on the surface to suffer whatever fate is happening at the time? So the other obvious thing is the sort of thinking around the Mars environment, is that we lived in sort of domed cities on the surface of the planet, where we create artificial environments under a dome. And again, we would be dealing with very similar issues there, but it would be things like dust is going to be a key issue for you there. Temperature, in terms of heat, the world will be much hotter. So how do you vary the temperature? And air conditioning is a huge energy absorber. So you would need more the energy than we have at the moment. And again, energy costs. So is it going to be rich people that can have air conditioning, and poor people are just going to have to use wet towels? How do we deal with that? And then on the surface, you will have a lot more extreme events. So flooding, windstorms. How do you deal with that in structures that are not necessarily designed for that? And again, the same things in terms of how do you communicate? How do you get between things, community, trade, exercise, and security? So the final one is so you've got living under the sea as a possibility, living in the earth in abandoned mines or silos is the other possibility, living on the surface of the planet under domed accommodation is the other one. And the final option is that you can move to the top of a mountain, which would put you above the sort of heat level. But the problem with the top of the mountain is, how do you build on top of the mountain? So we have construction that takes place at the top of the mountain, but it's very, very little construction it takes, which is very difficult to do that. So can you scale that? Can you do that at scale? And then the other problem that you have at high altitudes is the lack of oxygen, and then obviously the temperature extremes in terms of cold and ice and snow and building for that. Exercise, because food becomes a big issue. Is where do you do food, and how do you deal with that going forward? So those are the things that we deal with at this point in time, in terms of thinking of those localities. And so I was thinking, okay, so what is that if we use Zizek's thing of projecting into the future? If those 4 localities are the homes for us, the potential homes for us, what does that tell us about what we need for a home? And so for me, the first order things is that location is important. It has to be accessible, and it has to be, I don't know if constructible is an English word, but you have to be able to build stuff there. So it's not just that you can live there, that it is accommodates the structure, but that you have to be able to build the structure. And then you would need oxygen and clean enough air. You don't need pure air, but you need clean enough air, or you need a means to filter that air. You need temperature within a livable range. You need drinking water and wastewater. You're dealing with wastewater. And again, you don't need perfectly drinkable water, but you need it within certain parameters. And you've got to do something with your wastewater. It's toxic. If you don't deal with it, it leads to disease and other things. Food, we need crops, we need protein, you will need energy, and then we'll need protection from the sun, so irradiation protection. The sun is going to become harsher for us, carbon dioxide release, and then resilience to extreme events. So those are the things that we need for a home. And for us as humans, we would need to be able to talk to each other, we'd need to be able to see each other, do things together, we'd need to be able to exchange, and have exercise. We need to get our bodies moving. And gravity is different at the top of a mountain in terms of the effect of gravity to the bottom of the sea. So because of pressure. So how do you deal with those things? And then how do you deal with external threats? And largely, to a large extent, we have as humans thrived in the current environment. So we're at 8 billion people, just over 8 billion people at this point in time. And we live as best we can within the parameters that we are knowing at the moment. But those are going to change and going to change rapidly. And so the last point that I come to is that what we need for a home in 2055 doesn't exist for 10 billion people. And I have to say, I I don't know where that takes you. So do you, like Europe is doing at the moment, prepare for war in the assumption that only some people will have access to that future? Do you revolt and have sort of a socialist society that everyone has the same opportunity? Do you sneak off quietly and go and find yourself a house on the top of the mountain and hope that no one else thinks of that location? And I, in the work that I do in terms of mitigation and adaptation stuff, the assumption we make is that we will still live in the same place largely, and that's not going to be the case. We seem to be fairly sure about that at this point in time. And so that's the thought. And I want to dedicate this sort of here in terms of thinking that through, is that what we need for a home in 2055 doesn't exist for 10 billion people. And how do I, in that sense, respond to that? So Andrea, that's it from me. That's my input for today. So happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you, Gary. I don't know if I should thank you because that absolutely, yeah, terrifying presentation in a way. I mean, I know that one is supposed to think of radical change in terms of opportunity as well as potential cost, but the cost seems enormous. And yeah, I'm share your worry about the fact that, I mean, that was in fact the very first question that I put down the minute you started speaking was, well, can we rehome all of us? And that is clearly no. So yeah, what happens? So yes, thank you. Thank you very much for that. It's very thought-provoking. And I'd very much like to open the floor to comments and questions from everyone, even if it's just a response of, oh my gosh. So yes, anybody who's interested in kind of just expressing a response, just either put up your hand or put your video on. I see Matthias is, so yes, hi. Go for it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Gary. It was indeed a terrifying presentation. But I guess we can't expect anything else when we're speaking about these topics. I might have a couple of questions, but I just want to start with one. I just want to go back to that sort of strategy of Zizek that you sort of highlighted. And it seemed as if in your presentation you did something very different, because as I understood Zizek, the idea is to sort of imagine this dystopian future that we are going to have on this planet, and then sort of go back, in that imaginary future to the past, so to speak, and think about how we could avoid, how we can avoid that future, and then act in the present in such a way as to be sure that a scary future would not happen. But it seemed as if you sort of projected into the future. You already projected into this future where Earth would be uninhabitable in certain ways, and where certain utopian schemes would somehow manage to create some habitability for us. And then asked, how, are these utopias pragmatically, can we actually do it? Can we build those utopias? Which is a very different strategy from what Zizek, I think, had in mind. So I was just wondering if you would follow that Zizekian strategy more consistently, and you would have to imagine indeed a planet that is completely uninhabitable, dystopian, this and that, and then actually try to think, what can we in our present, the present ways of living, of housing, what can we do differently in the present to prevent that future from happening, which perhaps is more what you do in your practice. If you talk about adaptability and so on, you're probably more thinking about measures that can be implemented in the present and are perhaps more practicable than those utopian schemes that you sort of mainly analyzed in terms of feasibility. So I was just wondering, what was it the idea to implement this Zizekian strategy in your talk, and yeah, so that was sort of my first thought when I just tried to connect this Zizekian strategy with how what you discussed in your talk.
Absolutely, thanks, Matthias. I mean, so look, I'm new to Zizek, so I could have misunderstood entirely. But what I did in this exercise is, then for me in 2055, it's not the end of the world. Put it that way. It's there will be pockets of the world that will be livable in 2055 if you think of the dystopian sort of future. So and what I then said is, okay, in those pockets, what will it take to live in those pockets? And that brought me down to things like, we need clean air, we need water, we need energy, we need places that we can build stuff, So but that takes me back to the point of that. Actually, that's what we're doing at this point in time. We have actually done that relatively successfully, But what we're not going to be able to do is continue that. So then it takes me to a jump back to the future, where I say 10 billion people can't live in those pockets that I've imagined. And so almost it's a continual feedback loop that Zizek gets you into, is because so I imagined what we would need not to avoid the pockets of living in 2055. And I get to, but we are doing that at this point in time. We are, but that doing what we are at this point in time is going to lead us to this dystopian future. So it then takes me back to, okay, what do you do with 10 billion people in 2055? And I don't know is the honest answer to that question. I don't know what.
Yeah, but I would say if you take that feedback loop, in a sense, people already do that, as you point out, and I would also be interested to hear from your specialist view what do you see in terms of developments in the now. But for instance, just to say something stupid, which obviously is problematic, a lot of people would say, in order to prevent this terrible future, we have to, say, install solar panels on our house, capture rainwater, become sort of, make our house, how do you call it, autarkic, or
Yes,
from the grid,
yeah.
of the grid living, work towards smaller microgrids in terms of resources, electricity. But obviously, these things seem to be more like symptomatic solutions. Are they really going to prevent that future from happening? It might seem as if it's too little, and some kind of intervention needs to happen on a systemic scale, rather than that every personal community sort of comes up with some kind of solar power scheme or something like this. So I was just wondering, how do you, if people indeed already try to prevent that future through those very small, perhaps, and insufficient ways, what would you think in terms of cities and housing would be more effective, that are perhaps on a larger scale or more systemic level?
Yeah, so, Matthias, thanks. So in terms of the practical stuff, so the project that I work on is doing exactly that practical stuff, and we know in terms of mitigation, we have to stop burning carbon. We have to switch out from fossil fuels to something else. And electric vehicles is there. Hydrogen is there. We can use hydrogen as an alternative to gas. So that exists. And then doing off the grid, well, not necessarily off the grid, but becoming a prosumer than a consumer of energy. That exists at this point in time. And there's good examples of it taking place globally. So Germany has led the way in terms of solar. Norway's led the way in terms of wind. So those examples exist, and we've been doing it fairly successfully. So like China, for instance, is outstripping the world in terms of renewable energy installations. It still uses coal, but it's reducing its reliance on coal. It's not stopping coal, but it is reducing its reliance on coal over a period of time. So the adaptation, mitigation, and resilience stuff is taking place. And, as Andrea said at the beginning, we deliberately take a view from our project of the risk and opportunity of climate change. So we talk about the sort of green hydrogen economy that can bring stuff for us. A low carbon economy can bring opportunities and job opportunities and that kind of stuff. But the problem that I have is that when I project into the future, it doesn't work for 10 billion people. And a lot of people talk easily about population control, that population control is the way to do it. I mean, I think some of that is so sort of low-level racism because it's generally directed at Africa, but the population thing is that we've actually solved the population issue. We are reducing significantly in large parts of the world the population. It just takes time. We can't walk out into the streets and murder people, and we learned in COVID that if you lose a lot of people in one go, it actually damages whatever remains, is that you lose your structure of your economy, and your value chains are impacted. So mass murder isn't actually the answer either, even if you were a James Bond villain, so yeah, so so it takes me back to this 10 billion people, 2055 and 4 degrees temperature increase. Is what would we do differently? And the last point I wanted to make is that we are experiencing widespread systemic change at this point in time, and Trump is leading that. He is taking us back to the fossil fuel, the drill, baby, drill, the short-term comfort. I want to live in the moment, and I want to live comfortably. I want to be a consumer. Trump is the sort of vanguard of that expression. I mean, it's not we all want to live like Americans live, and the problem for us is that the carbon footprint of Americans is something is the worst on the planet at this point in time. We need something like 5 planets. If everyone in the world lived like Americans, we'd need 5 planets to sustain us. So if we lived like Africans, we would not need we would be fine. We'd be absolutely fine. So the Zizek thing for me creates this loop where the first loop is easy. The first loop is easy, but then I'm like, actually, oops, I'm still not at the 10 billion people, and so I leave that as an open question for me to work on this year, is to then think, because we've done all the mitigation and adaptation stuff, it's all cutting edge, but it doesn't answer the question of why Trump is allowed to do what Trump does, and why humans generally are going away from that. The things that we know that we should be doing. The Paris Accord, none of the countries are. So we meant to update our commitments this year in Brazil. None of the countries. I think there's 5 out of 195 that are anywhere close to the commitments that are required. And one of them was America, and no longer. So yeah. So I mean, look, I'm desperate to get out of the dystopian thing. My daughter and I have a sort of a flag system where she raises a flag at a certain point, because I keep on saying, this is your future, not mine, So she gets a little bit irritated with me, but that is the reality, and yeah. So that's the work for me this year.
Okay, thanks. Could we get a couple more voices into the conversation? I see that there are 2 people who've responded on chat, and I'd like you to maybe just speak to your chat. So perhaps Sharon first, and then Richard.
So you mean I must really speak, okay?
Yes.
I was just thinking, you speak of those who can adapt being the ones who evolve, but when I look at this, or think through these issues, then it strikes me that they are going to be very expensive. And sorry, I can't put my video on. I am here. They are going to be very expensive, and that, I don't even know if the middle class person will afford those. So, who's going to survive ultimately? I mean, realistically, it's going to be the super wealthy, the wealthy who
Musk, Putin.
Elon Musk,
to be in that world.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So Shannon, that's the basic premise of the Don't Look Up movie. I don't know if you've seen it, but you should go and watch it again, because they create this scene with Musk to the T. They have this entrepreneur that comes with some crazy idea, and there's actually a comparison where they show the scene in the movie and the scene with Musk in the cabinet meeting, and it's almost exactly a copy and paste thing of the image. So you're right. I mean, at this point in time, that, so like that silo I showed you is for rich people, and that is, and not middle class. It's above middle class,
Yeah.
And I mean, the old adage is that it's the middle class that create revolutions, not the working class. It is when they start feeling it that you really see revolutions, and I think that you will see that fairly soon. You're gonna So Trump is going to take us back, and we're going to experiment with his way of the world, and it's I'm fairly sure it's not going to work, you know, and we're going to be in a worse position, because this is actually the critical time in terms of climate change for us to do the changes that we should be doing to avoid the 2-degree thing, and we're doing exactly the opposite, you know. So and literally exactly the opposite. So you're quite right. It's going to be the rich people. On my first loop of the Zizek cycle, it is the rich people that survive, you know.
Reminds me of that movie, Elysium. You know, it's like our world is moving more and more towards that as a reality. Depressing.
And which is already so in South Africa, where it's only a top segment of the population that can afford all that rainwater, you know, conversion to drink water, solar power, or living in an ecological estate. I mean, this is basically for the rich in South Africa, and the rest just lives in some kind of desert. In terms of,
I see Richard has a question there. I don't know, Richard, if you want to pose it, or I'll just read it.
Hi, everyone. Yes, yes, I'm just wondering if all these future habitations aren't best thought of as practice for our expansion into outer space. Okay, because the fact is that the Earth will not remain habitable indefinitely. Okay, so supposing someone waved a magic wand and overnight all our problems were solved. Okay, the environmental crisis, the politics, everything. Okay, the fact is that eventually, all the planets in the solar system are gradually receding from the sun. They're getting further away. Okay, so this is not got to do this the expansion of space time. It's by inertia and other forces. So in a vacuum, any body will moving body will travel in a straight line at a uniform speed unless reacted on by another force. So the force in here is gravity, the gravitational pull of the sun, and the planets want to travel straight. So the combination of those means that the Earth is slowly moving away from the sun. So at the present, the Earth is in what is known called the Goldilocks zone. It's where there's the conditions are right for liquid water, which is the precondition of life. So, for example, Venus is too close to the sun, so it's too hot, and Mars is too cold. So eventually, the Earth will move out of this habitable zone, like in a few 100 million years. It doesn't matter how long it takes. But, you know, so eventually the Earth will become uninhabitable. Then you might think, well, we can planet hop, go to Venus. But then in the further future, the sun will start exhausting its nuclear fuel. It'll swell to a red giant, and all the inner planets will be consumed. And all the outer planets, the gas giants, all their atmosphere will be stripped off. So in the long run, there's little option except to go out into outer space. And I think these what you're talking about here, these habitations just will be practice for doing that. Yeah. So that's, of course, that's all speculation, but I'd just like to, that's my comment. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Richard. I mean, I think, you know, so the Musk example is living on Mars is the.
I was going to add, by the way, the expansion to outer space, again, it's going to be mostly for rich people.
Yeah.
But the poor have always found a way to take the back roads. So, yeah.
I'm not sure if there's a back road to Mars, but the thing is about living on Mars is the things that they have to do to survive there are the things that we should be doing to survive on this planet.
Exactly.
So the saving water, how they generate oxygen, how they deal with their trash and all that kind of stuff. If we lived that way on this planet, we would have a home here for another 1,000 years. You know, so the future that you're talking about is a very distant future for humanity. And
it's still, yeah.
we might not be here.
That's for sure, but still, yeah. But the other thing I was thinking about is oxygen generation is probably the hydrogen fuel cells. Yeah, that's what they use on the space shuttle and the International Space Station and stuff. It separates water into hydrogen, which is your fuel, and oxygen, which you can breathe. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, we're doing that fairly successfully, and that's a leading technology now that we're trying to harness.
Exactly.
Yeah, so,
it needs much more development.
yeah. Jason?
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Again, for that really constrained sense of thanks. But something that this has me thinking, and I'm a sci-fi, cli-fi fan, so I spend a lot of time in this agonizing headspace. But what I wanted to ask was completely related to, but not the same as the comment I put in the text. But what I wanted to mention was I'm absorbing everything you're saying, but I want to just run alongside and give myself an excuse to be moderately optimistic, but not because I'm denying any of it, which goes something like this. Charles Stross, the sci-fi writer, wrote a while back that you can looking back, it's very apparent that most notions of the singularity and people playing with the idea of a runaway technological singularity just look like the hype that made sense to people in Silicon Valley inside of the tech bubble before it burst. And they built their fiction projecting out from that. And it doesn't make as much sense anymore the way it did inside of that. Don't tell half a dozen people who still try to sell books about it, but that's his claim. And one of my thoughts was just how many of these examples are premised on exactly the thing we've all been noting. You've got to have something incredibly resource intensive. It's got to be small scale and local, and you'd have to be very rich for it. And so I want to say two things. I want to suggest that it's entirely possible that we're all stuck in the nuclear bunker paradigm, left over from a different generation of worrying about a different apocalypse, and that shapes a lot of these outcomes or possible thoughts. And there may be middle grounds, and one that pops up, but I feel incredibly naive because this is your area. But one that pops up is, instead of these alternate routes, something like, instead of building arcologies where you've got one big system which is impervious to the outside weather like a dome, that you could put in arcologizing infrastructure. So you roof over enough streets with shade mechanisms, you build tall enough, often enough, in enough places that you can access the cool air and use low energy chimneys. Places that are near the water can have deep water heat exchangers, and their purpose isn't to feed specific rich people's seasteads, it's to feed that infrastructural support back into hardened cities that exist. So the one thought is, in theory, that push for middle class survival and support would take the place, the role of exactly what you're describing, of people assuming that we stay roughly in place. And maybe that means we rope more buildings together and glass more of them over and rely on more technologies that integrate things into one system. But trees are hardy and forests are hardy in ways that individual plants exposed to the environment aren't. So I just want to, this isn't a deeply thought out thing. I've got a dozen little gimmicks that pop up in my head. But what I wanted to say was, we have these paradigms of the bunker and the seastead and the rich person's space. And I don't think it's impossible to think about whether the same sorts of technologies applied at the same scales could be used to make larger neighborhoods than that robust. We might not be able to, this might not be a place for 10 million people living on the surface, but it might be that it's not the rich man's domed city, it's the integrated infrastructure in a few cities, which also have to now be growing their own food, which also have to be processing their own water without being able to rely on surrounding countryside. But I'll shut up in a second, but the Parthian shot is that some of this pops up in, I am blanking on the name of the guy who wrote The Dawn of Everything, the anarchist anthropologist. It'll come to me in a moment.
Yes.
But it might ring a bell. There we go. But one of his arguments was that there's been this paradigm, because what a lot of this sounds like is the paradigm story of human civilization. It became easier to centralize in big cities, so we were forced to do that. And he argues that people did do that, but it was never a monomyth. It was never a monolithic story. People also ran away and hid in different places. Now, the idea is I notice this trend in the story that we'll all have to hunker down in some version of a bunker at whatever scale. And it leaves me wondering about, well, maybe we're just assuming that because we've absorbed the myth that that's the only way to survive is to centralize the infrastructure. And maybe, in fact, there are multiple strategies that would coexist.
Yeah, so Jason, I mean, I think I agree with you in terms of the and that's where I get to on the sort of second loop of the Zizek cycle, is that 10 billion people won't live there. So we have to actually rethink what we think is living, because essentially the bunker living is a cheaper version of middle life, middle class living at the present, you know. Or a scaled down version of it, but it's still middle class. We still think of, you know, having a TV set, and we have to really think. And I'm not sure that we're doing that at this point in time. Is that the way we're approaching climate change is based on those assumptions that we have running through our thinking. I see Glenn's hand, and it's David Graeber and David Vengro that is the authors of the book you're thinking of.
Those are the ones.
Thanks so much, Gary. Fascinating as always, and I love being rattled by you with your presentations often. But I also am thinking about this loop that you've unpacked, and I love one of the comments that you made, which said that nature doesn't strategize, she flows and evolves. I'm just summarizing your words there, but I'm wondering why we are not considering the loop bringing us back to primitivism, forcing us back to it. And why we are not considering the ways of being of the indigenous and aboriginal societies in various parts of the world. I know you're advocating for that, but why that seems to be shunned in favor of the technological solution, like the drilling down and building huge bunkers, or why not caves? Why not forests? How do the Swahili people live in the northern parts of Africa, or people in Morocco? How are our indigenous San Bushman people and who still live in the desert in Namibia, their descendants, thriving in hostile climates? Why do we disregard the return to primitivism as essential in order to buy humanity some more time and to buy the planet some more time? Because yes, we do know it's all going to go into decay eventually, but thinking about the thriving of humanity on this planet, why has the primitive aspect, I personally feel this is nature's way of saying you will just go back to wearing animal skin. There will be no need to manufacture denim or cotton linen or whatever. Going back to hunting and gathering seeds and little nuts and living off of dates, off of palm trees and so forth. What are your thoughts about this? Why does humanity not want to accept primitivism as a solution? Thanks, Gary, as always.
Awesome. Thanks, Glenn. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to give you a very quick response to that, but I think you're quite right. There's, what's his name? There's sorry, I can't find the guy now, but there's a sociologist that's worked on the size of communities, Robin Dunbar. And he talks about 150 being the number, which kind of follows primitive societies in terms of that's the sustainable number in terms of sustaining communication amongst a functioning group and that kind of stuff. And it seems to be in So that kind of natural living, if you want to call it that, that's the size that a tribe or a group can exist at. So the primitive living, I think, is a way that humans will continue. And I've just seen some theory that at some point we had a crisis on the planet and we reduced ourselves to a silly number, like something like 2,000 or 3,000 humans. We went through some window. And so it is entirely possible, I think, that you would have bunker living and primitive living as the two options going forward. So those that can't afford the bunkers are going to live primitively and live in adapting to the world at the time. And so we'll go back to that kind of basic stuff. But it ain't pretty living. It isn't comfortable living. It isn't, we've changed out of the majority of us don't live in primitive circumstances anymore. Because it's damn hard walking 20 kilometers to fetch water, so so we are these efficiency driven systems that don't like to work per se. And I'm not sure that what the resources that exist on the planet can compartmentalize 10 billion people into groups of 150 sufficiently to be able to survive in that system. But these are initial thoughts, which we'll spend the year, at least I will hopefully spend the year working through a little bit in more constructive and better verbalize it a little bit better. So Andrea, I think Emma had a point there just about the 10 richest people in the world at the moment.
Some information.
There's this sort of meme going around about eat the rich, and it might be that we get to that point, that. So my apologies. Just in closing, my apologies to everyone. I try not to be depressing or doomist in this approach, but I think you have to look at 2055 and say it's going to be a different world to what we are used to at this point in time. And I think to Jason's point is that maybe it is not the way we live as much as the way we think about living that is the thing that needs changing. But yes, thank you very much, Andrew, for that. Back to you.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Gary. I'm seeing a couple of comments in the chat and all of that yet it's pretty hard not to be pessimistic, but thank you very much. It was a very thought-provoking, and I have to say, just a quick comment, I really like the idea of potentially networked complex solutions rather than bunker or dome thinking. I think that is something that maybe we need to trigger our imaginations towards. It sounds like a very interesting prospect. Okay, so yes, thank you very much for that. I know that we will be continuing all of these thoughts and questions and ideas and imaginations for the entire year to come. And I just want to say that next week we will be chatting with Emma, and we will be taking a completely different approach towards fabulating, imagining the future, and it might be something close to what Glenn was talking about. There might be some resonance there with your concerns, Glenn. So I'm not going to give anything away, but I'll send the invitation out soon. And yes, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you all next week, I hope. Okay, thank you, and goodbye.